Hi guys, good evening everyone. What we discussed in the last session, do you remember? Guys, do you remember what we discussed in the last session? In the last session, we discussed about the overview of our microservices classes and we discussed about what is a Jipkin server and how we are going to use Jipkin server in our microservices based applications. We understood what is monolith architecture, pros and cons of monolith architecture, microservices introduction, pros and cons of microservices, microservices architecture, service registry, admin server to monitor and manage our applications, Jipkin server and Slate server. Jipkin is used to monitor observability of our microservices. Backend APIs we have developed, and we understood inter-service communication by using FIAN client. Load balancing we understood with ribbon, API gateway with the filters and routings we have understood. Now, today we are going to understand another important topic in the microservices, which is called config server. Cloud config server we are going to understand. Right guys, cloud config server. Cloud config server is used to externalize application properties. So as of now, what we are doing here, we are creating our applications. So if we see our JDBC applications or WebMVC applications, in our applications, we are configuring data source properties in our application YML file. So this is our application YML file. In this YML file, we are configuring our data source properties. So whenever we package our application, the data source properties also will be packaged along with that. So can I say this? We are making our application and our application properties tightly coupling. Can I say that our application and our application properties are tightly coupled? Yes, we can say that our application and application properties are tightly coupled. The reason is within the application, we are having a YML file. Within the YML file, we are configuring our properties. So now this application will be packaged as a jar file, and that jar file will be deployed in the servers, or we will run the jar file. Tomorrow, if I want to make some changes to the properties, then I need to change the properties in the application, and I need to repackage the application as a jar file, and I need to execute that jar file. So here, that is not at all recommended. So now, as of now, we are configuring properties in application.properties file or application.yml file. The properties file or YML file is packaged along with the application. Application.properties or application.yml file will be packaged along with our application. Will be packaged along with our application. If I want to change any property, then I need to repackage my application. I need to repackage my application as a jar file. If we want to make any changes to the properties, then we have to repackage our application. If we want to make any changes to properties, then we have to repackage our application. This is not recommended. To decouple, to externalize application properties from the application code, to externalize properties, to externalize properties from the application, we can use cloud config server. So what is the main purpose of cloud config server? I don't want to combine my application code and my application properties. If I combine my application code and my application properties like this, Tomorrow, if I want to make any changes to the properties, I need to repackage my application. I want to separate my application and application properties. I want to externalize properties from the application. To externalize properties from the application, we can use Cloud Config Server. Okay, guys. So if you want to make any changes to the properties, then you no need to touch your application. How this Cloud Config Server concept is going to work? Okay, let us see here. Now, whatever the properties I want to keep for my application, I will maintain them in one repository that is called my GitHub repo. Inside the GitHub repository, I will keep all the properties files that are required for my application. Suppose if you have welcome project, now welcome.yml file. If you have greet project, greet.yml file. If you have product project, product.yml. If you have admin project, admin.yml. So for every project, properties file is required. Now, instead of configuring the properties within the application, I will configure the application properties in the GitHub repository. Welcome project related configuration will be available in the welcome.yml. Greet application related configuration will be available in the greet.yml. Product application related configuration will be available in the product.yml. Similarly, admin application related configuration will be available in the admin.yml. Any properties that I want to use in these applications, I will write in these YML files. Now, to load the data from these YML files, I'm going to create one config server application. I will create one config server application. This application is responsible to load the properties from these YML files which are available in the Git repository. One config server application will be created. That a config server application is responsible to load the properties from these YMLs. Once the properties are loaded from the config server, now I will connect my applications to the config server. Welcome API will be available. This welcome API will connect to the config server to get the properties required for the welcome API. Similarly, the remaining APIs also will be connected to config server. Greet API will be available. Greet API will be available. Product API will be available. And similarly, admin API will be available. So I'm having 4 microservices in my project. Assume that welcome API is one microservice. Greet API is one microservice. Product API is one microservice. Admin API is one microservice. In these APIs, I'm not going to keep the configuration in the properties file because if I want to change it, then I need to redeploy my application. So that's why I will keep my application properties in the GitHub repository. Now, who will load the properties from the GitHub repository? My config server will load from the GitHub repository. How properties will come to my application? My application will connect with the config server and my application will load the properties from the config server. So tomorrow, if I want to make any changes to the configuration properties, do I need to repackage my application? Do I need to redeploy my application or my application redeployment is not required? Do I need to redeploy my application or I no need to redeploy my application? I no need to redeploy my application. Why I no need to redeploy my application? Where the properties will be available? Properties will be available in the GitHub repository. Who will load the properties from the GitHub repository? My config server will load the properties from the GitHub repository. How the properties will come to our microservices? Our microservices will connect with the config server. So what is the benefit we are getting with this approach, guys? Can anyone tell me what is the benefit we are getting with this approach? Can anyone tell me what is the benefit we are getting with this approach? We are decoupling our application code and application properties. We are decoupling our application code and our application properties. Our application is loosely coupled with the properties. Our application is loosely coupled with the properties. Tomorrow, if I make any code changes, if I make any changes in the properties file, for example, database password or database username or any other properties, if I change in the properties file, do I need to repackage my application? Do I need to repackage my application? No, because my application does not have any properties. My application will connect to the config server to get the properties. Config server will get the properties from our GitHub repository. Config server will connect with the GitHub repository to get the properties. Tomorrow, if any changes happened in the properties, then I no need to repackage my application. So what is a config server? Cloud config server. As of now, we are configuring the properties in application.properties or application.yml file. For example, it can be DB properties, it can be SMTP properties, it can be Kafka properties, it can be application messages, etc. So in our microservices, we will be using database properties, we will be using SMTP properties, we will be using Kafka properties, and we will be using several messages also. As of now, we are configuring properties in application.properties file or application.yml file. Application.properties file or application.yml file will be packaged along with our application. If you want to make any changes to properties, then we have to repackage our application. So to externalize properties from the application, we can use cloud config server. We can use cloud config server. If you see the architecture, whatever the properties we want to use for our applications, we will configure them in the GitHub with our project name. Welcome API related configuration will be available in the welcome.yml. It can be database, it can be SMTP, it can be actuator, whatever it is. Whatever the properties that are required for the welcome API will be configured in the welcome.yml. Similarly for greet API, product API, and admin API. Whatever the properties are required for the greet API will be there in the greet YML. So now, whatever the YML files are available, that YML files Git repository location I will give to config server. Config server will load those YML files. Our applications will connect to the config server, and the config server will provide the properties related to our application. With this cloud config server, we are able to externalize configuration properties of our application. Tomorrow, if we want to make any changes to the properties of our application, we no need to repackage our application because our application and properties both are separated. Application will load the properties by using config server. Now, let us try to develop this application and let us try to understand this. Cloud config server. So in order to develop this cloud config server application, first step that we need to do, create a Git repository and keep application.yml files related to. Create Git repository and keep YML files required for projects. Okay. Create Git repository and keep YML files required for the projects. I have created one Git repository. In my Git repository, I have stored my YML files. Let me go to my GitHub. You can create one repository here and you can keep your repository. Here, I have one repository with a name called configuration properties. I have a repository with a name called configuration properties. Greet.yml, welcome.yml, I kept it. Greet.yml will contain message as good morning, something like this. Welcome.yml contains a message as welcome to Ashok IT. So here we need to create a file with the application name that we are going to configure. For greet application, I will give the application name as a greet. That's why it is available as a greet.yml. For application product, product.yml file. For application admin, admin.yml file. Welcome.yml file, greet.yml file. How many microservices you have in your project? For every microservice, one YML file should be created with the name of the service. Greet.yml, welcome.yml. So that is the first step that we need to do. Create Git repository and keep YML files required for our projects. File name should be our project name. We should keep file name as project application name. We should keep file name as application name. Suppose you have app name as greet. Okay, app name greet, then file name should be greet.yml. If your app name is welcome, then file name that you need to keep as welcome.yml. Perfect. Then create Spring Starter application with the below dependency. Create Spring Starter application with the below dependency. Now we need to create a project Spring Starter application. That application should act as a config server application. To represent that application as a config server application, we need to add this dependency. This dependency will represent that this is a config server application. It will load the properties from GitHub repository which we have given. And next step is we need to enable right below and write configure, right enable config server annotation at boot start class. Okay, so we are creating one Spring Boot application. In that Spring Boot application, we need to configure cloud config server. I'm configuring the cloud config server project. In that cloud config server, to represent that project as a config server, we need to write this annotation Spring Cloud config server. Then write enable configure server annotation at boot start class. This annotation we need to write. Configure git repository URL in the application.yml file like this. Right? This is the fourth step. Configure below properties in application.properties file. Configure below properties in the application properties file. I'm specifying for the cloud config server from where it has to load my properties. The properties are available in the GitHub repository. So with this, our config server application will be ready. Run the config server application. Run config server application. So we need to prepare one application as a config server. So what are the steps we need to follow to create our config server application? Create a Git repository and keep YMLs required for the project. So here I'm giving my Git repo URL. I'm giving my Git repository URL. In this Git repository URL, I have configured my YML files. Welcome project YML is available. Greet project YML is also available. This is my GitHub repository. Then create one boot application by adding config server dependency. Then write this annotation to represent this application as a config server. From where this config server has to get the properties of our microservices. For that, we need to configure below properties in the application.yml file. Okay, let me create that project. Guys. So it is going to become file new. My Git repository already available, file new. Let me create the project name as 36 config server app. This is my application, which is acting as a config server. Click on next. Now here, I'm going to select the dev tools and let me add config server. Cloud config server. There are two options available. Config client available. Config server is available. Config server means central management for the configuration via Git, SVN or HashiCorp Vault. Let me go for config server dependency. I told you. Create a project with the config server by using this dependency. My repository already created, so I'm taking that repository URL. I'm creating a project by adding cloud config server URL. Okay, click on next. Dev tools also I have added. Click on finish. So with this, my cloud config server is getting created. My application is getting created. Now, once this cloud config server application got created, go to our pom.xml and check this. Go to pom.xml and check this. Now we got Spring Cloud config server dependency and we have the dev tools and the test dependency is available. That's it. Now let me specify this application as a config server. Go to application.java. Let me write one annotation, enable config server. To represent this application as a config server, we need to write one annotation called enable config server annotation. Enable config server annotation I am writing. Okay, good. Now I need to specify that from where this application has to load the properties. Go to YML file, convert the properties file to YML file. Then we need to configure our GitHub repository URL in that YML. We need to configure our GitHub repository in the YML to load the properties from that location. Okay, guys. So I have given my GitHub repository. You can give your GitHub repository here. This is the path where my configuration files are available. Clone on start. That means once my config server is started, it will load the properties. Okay. Now refresh this project. Let us do Maven update project. Let us do Maven update. Once this Maven update is completed, let me load these properties. Let me run this application first. I'm running my config server application. Config server application is connected to GitHub repository. I have given the path of the GitHub repository. Right click, run as boot application. Let us verify our config server is getting started or not. Let us verify our config server is getting started or not. Yes, application is trying to start. It is running on the port number 8080, default port number of embedded container. Apache Tomcat is coming as embedded container, running on the port number 8080. So with this, it started. Okay, guys. So with this, my application started. This is acting as a config server. Let me check it. Go to the browser and let me check whether it is loading the properties or not. Localhost colon 8080/default/welcome. 8080 default/welcome. So is it able to load the welcome properties here? Right. Name is default, profiles welcome, label is null, version number, state is equal to null, property sources. Now, similarly, let us take the grid. Now, grid properties it is loading. Yes, grid profile is available. Default grid. So grid is my app name. Welcome is my app name. So with this, my config server application started. Once the config server application is started, then what is the next step? My Git repository is available. My YML files are there. My config server is also ready. Now I need to develop my client application. That client application will communicate with the config server to get the properties. So how to create our client application? Okay, client development. Create Spring Boot application with below dependencies. Config server client development. Config server client development. So now create our application, create Spring Boot application, create Spring Boot application with the below dependencies. So what are the dependencies? One is we need web starter and configure client. Config server application is already ready. Now we need to go for configure client and let me go for some dev tools. Web starter, then config client, then dev tools. So config client dependency will be looking like this. Config client dependency will be looking like this. Then next step, create a REST controller. Create REST controller with required methods. Okay. Now in the REST controller, I want to load the message which is available in the GitHub repository. Now configure config server URL in the YML file. Configure config server URL in application.yml file. Config server URL in the application.yml file like below. Run the application and test it. Okay. Run the application and test it. Let us see here it is working or not. Run the application and test it. Really, is our application working or not? We can test it. Now, my config server is ready. Let me run my config client application. File, new, Spring Starter project. Let me create this as 37 config server client application. Now I need to select web starter, dev tools, and I need to go for config client. Okay. Config client, I'm going to select Spring Cloud config. Client that connects to the cloud config server to fetch the application configuration. Click on next, click on finish. My config client application is getting created. In this application, what are the dependencies available? Let us verify that. Now, if you see Spring Boot Starter web dependency added to create a REST controller, and I have taken Cloud Starter config dependency. It is used to connect my application with the config server to fetch the properties. And I have taken dev tools and a test dependency available. That is fine. So we are able to complete our first step. Create boot application with below dependencies. Web starter, config client, dev tools. Config client will look like this. Okay. Then create a REST controller with required methods. So in this REST controller, I will connect with the config server to get the properties. Now, new class, I will go for greet REST controller. We'll go for greet REST controller. To represent this class as a REST controller, I will use one annotation called @REST controller. @REST controller. Let me write one method, public string get greet message. Public string get greet message. Okay. To get that message, I will write private string message here. Now, whatever the message I am getting from that, I want to return that message. So from where I want to get this message? This message, I can hard code in my YML, but I don't want to do that. I want to get that message from my greet YML file. What is the key here? Message is the key. Take this key and configure that as a value. @value, I'm going to specify $ of this key. I'm going to specify $ of this key. Okay. And I'm going to specify refresh scope. I'm going to specify refresh scope. Convenience annotation to put beans annotated. This can be refreshed at runtime, and any components that are using them will get new instance on the next method call. Fully initialized and injected with all the dependencies. So whenever you configure refresh scope, if any properties are changed in the config server, it will be refreshing that. It will get the new properties from the config server. So without restarting, I can load the properties dynamically. For that, I'm going for this refresh scope. $message. Now here, if you go to our properties file, config.application.properties, I'm converting to YML. In this YML, nothing is available. In this YML, I'm going to configure my config server details. So this server will run on the port number 9090. My config server is running on the port number 8080. Okay, application name is greet. If I give application name as a greet here, it will connect to greet.yml to get the properties. If I give the application name as welcome, it will get the message from the welcome YML. Now, so in my project, I am giving just a name as greet, and I am giving the config server, my application running on the port number 9090. Here I am having greet REST controller. What my greet REST controller will do? Greet REST controller wants a message. Where is that message? In the YML. Where is that YML? YML is available in the Git repository. From the Git repository, YML will be loaded by the config server. From the config server, my API will load the YML file. I don't want to hard code the messages in the application. I want to externalize my messages. to externalize our messages, we are going for config server concept. Now let me run my application. Right click on this, refresh. Right click on this, Maven, update project, force update. Okay, I have changed it. My application will run on the port number 9090 and my application will be connected to the config server. Now, if you see here, my config server is running on the port number 8080. My Greet API running on the port number 9090. For the Greet API, I have configured the name as Greet. So there is a YML with a name called greet.yml. So when I access my Greet API REST controller method, my REST controller method returning the message is having @value. That means it should come from the YML. In which YML this message available? In my project YML the message available? No. In which YML the message available? In the Greet YML the message is available. In the Greet YML the message available. Who is loading that Greet YML? Config server. How my API loading the messages? Through config server. Now let's verify this. Are we able to get that message or not? Right click, refresh. Now run as boot application. My config application, client application I will run. It will run on the port number 9090. It will run on my port number 9090. Now it is running on the port number 9090. Are you guys clear? Now you see here what is the message? Fetching the configurations from the server, that is config server URL. So whatever the database properties that are required, whatever the SMTP properties that are required, that will come from config server now. Nothing is available in my application YML. Within my application YML, I told from where it has to get the properties. It has to get the properties from config server. Localhost :9090, Greet REST controller is available. Let me give you a mapping for this. @get mapping / okay. Dev tools available. It will restart my server. No issue. I will send you a request to this method. I will send you a request to this REST controller method now. Localhost :9090. Localhost :9090. Are we able to get the message as good morning? When I send the request to my REST controller, am I able to get the message as good morning? But tell me, where exactly that good morning message available? In which YML that message is available now? In which YML that message is available? Is it my project YML? Is it GitHub repository YML? Is it my project YML or is it Git repository YML? It is Git repository YML. If I want to change my message, okay, I will go to GitHub repository. Greet YML is available. Let me change that message to good evening, guys. Good morning message available. I'm changing to good evening message. Now, do I need to repackage my application? Guys, do I need to repackage my application? Or only restart is required? Repackaging is different. Restart is required. Restart is required or repackaging is required. Do I need to repackage my application as a jar file or just I need to restart my jar, restart my server? I just need to restart my server. Stop this client application and start the client application again. I no need to repackage that as a jar file. Run as a boot application. Now I am restarting my client application. After restarting my client application, then just access our URL once again. Now access our URL once again. After restarting my server, I'm trying to access my application. Am I able to get the latest message? Earlier it is having good morning. Now it is having good evening. Earlier it is having good morning. Now it is having good evening. Are you clear? What is the benefit of going for config server now? Are you clear with the benefits of going for config server? Yes, tell me guys, what is the benefit of going for config server now? Cloud config server. What is the benefit with the cloud config server? Now, do you think that database properties will be configured within our project YML file, or they will be configured in the Git repository YMLs? Application is decoupled from the properties. Application is decoupled from the properties. So for every microservice, one YML file will be created like this. For every microservice, one YML will be created like this. And that YMLs can be available with the profiles as well. Welcome dev.yml, welcome sit.yml, welcome prod.yml, greet sit.yml, greet prod.yml, greet dev.yml. So for every application, multiple profiles will be available. Those profiles will be configured in the GitHub repository. Those will be loaded by the config server. Our microservices will connect to the config server to load the properties. So tomorrow, if any property needs to be changed, we just need to restart our server. We no need to repackage our application. We no need to repackage our application. We just need to restart our server. Our application will connect with the config server to get the properties. Config server will get the properties from the YML. See, where is the connection between our application to the config server, from the config server to the YML? If you see first, when we created the config server, in the config server application YML, I have configured GitHub repository. In the config server application, I have given my GitHub repository. What is the meaning of giving the GitHub repository in the config server? Config server should get the properties from this YML. Config server should get the properties from the YML files. In the GitHub repository, whatever the YMLs are available, those YMLs will be loaded by our config server. So I have given GitHub repository URL to config server application running on the port number 8080. Then after that, I have created one client application. In the client application, I want to read one property. Here I'm creating one REST controller. In the REST controller, I'm taking message with @value. This is a key in the YML. Now, this application should connect with the config server. And what is the name of the application? So here, Spring config import config server URL I'm giving. My application will run on the port number 9090. Config server running on the port number 8080. What is the name of my application? Greet. So here, in my application, I'm telling the application name as Greet. When I tell the application name as a Greet, config server will load the data from the greet.yml file. Here, whatever the name we are configuring in the application YML for the application name, this name should match with this file name. Are you guys clear? So whatever the name you are configuring for the application, that name should match with the file name. So based on this name, our application connected to config server will load the data from the greet YML, will give to your application. So that is the relation. Whatever the name is available for the file, with that name, we need to configure application name. So here, what I configured as a application name, I configured application name as a greet. So it connected to greet.yml and it is getting the message which is available in the greet.yml. For example, if I configure application name as a welcome, then what will happen? It will connect to welcome.yml file and it will get the message from the welcome file. Now let us see localhost :9090. It is coming welcome to Ashok IT. So earlier it is giving me good evening. Now it is giving me welcome to Ashok IT. Why? In both YML files, same keys are available. When I give the application name as greet, it is getting the message from the greet.yml. When I give the application name as welcome, it is getting the message from the welcome.yml available in the GitHub. So based on the application name, we need to create the YML. Based on the application name, that particular YML properties will be loaded by our application from the config server. Now you see, when I'm sending the request for the same REST controller, I'm getting welcome to Ashok IT. The reason in this welcome.yml message having welcome to Ashok IT. Suppose if I give the application name as greet instead of the welcome, if I give the application name as greet, it will get the messages from greet.yml. It is having good evening message. It will get connect with the greet. It is referring to greet application. Greet application having its own YML. Then when I send the request, it is giving good evening message. Now do you understand? Now do you understand how our application connecting to config server and how it is deciding from which YML it has to get the properties? Yes. Application name and YML name should be matched. Then only it will understand which YML file is belongs to which project. So this is all about cloud config server in the Spring Boot. In the real time, for every project, this cloud config server concept will be available. Nobody will configure the properties within the application.yml of our project. If we configure the properties within our project YML, tomorrow, if you want to change, then you need to repackage your project. That is difficult. That's why we want to separate our application and application properties. To separate our application and application properties, we are going to use config server. Whatever the properties that are required for our application, with application name, YMLs will be created in the GitHub repository. That GitHub repository will be given as an input for the config server. And with that config server, we will connect with our application. Our application will connect to config server to get the properties. This is all about cloud config server concept, guys. It is very important topic. In every real-time project, this config server will be implemented. In the interview, people will ask you where you will configure database properties of your application. We will be configuring in the GitHub repository. We will load them with the config server. Now, do I need to configure data source properties in our application.yml, or it is not required? Do I need to configure data source properties in the application.yml of our project? No, it will be loaded by config server based on our application name. Whatever the name you give for the application, with that name, one YML file should be available. From there, it will load the properties. Good, guys. Anybody having any questions on the config server? You can ask me now.
Sir, in case we use cloud, sir, that is AWS, and if we deploy over there, then also where will the config be present, sir? In GitHub only or?
GitHub only, sir. GitHub only.
Okay.
Config server is one project. Config server will load from the GitHub repository.
Okay.
Hi, yes, sir.
Yes.
Yes, continue. What to do if we have more than more property files? I mean, more than one file, one API.
Profiles. So one project will have only one YML, not multiple YMLs.
Okay.
Suppose if you have a product API, there will be only one YML, product.yml. That's it. Maybe profiles can be available. Product_dev.yml, product_sit.yml, product_prod.yml. Profiles will be available, but all the configuration should be there in the one YML, not multiple YMLs.
Okay, like error message, database details, and other messages.
Everything should be there in one file. Yes, everything should be there in one file.
Okay. And what is?
Sir.
One by one.
Hello.
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. Suppose, sir, I have 5 microservices. So for all those microservices, the database properties will be same. So how can
still you need to configure them in the separate file. That is what we discussed. Multiple configurations we need to do when we go for microservices. Every microservice should have its own properties file. In that file, you need to configure your data source properties.
So for each and every microservices, I have to follow the YAML file with same database connectivity.
Yes, you need to do that.
Okay, got it.
Sir, in client application, multiple file is possible for added.
Sorry?
In client application, multiple application is added to the YML file.
Only one name will be available for the application. Now, whatever the name you will give, With that name only, it will load the file. If you give the name as a greet, it will check for the greet.yml. If you give the name as welcome, it will check for welcome.yml. If you give the name as admin, admin.yml, it will load. Not multiple files, only one file should be there.
Okay, for the only use for the do not repackage the application. That the reason
Yes,
this concept is using.
correct.
Okay.
Hello, sir.
Yes.
Hello, sir. For configuration, HashiCorp also there is, no?
HashiCorp, Paul, that is a different story, sir. I also don't know how to work with that. In my project, we are having config server.
हेलो सर।
Okay, sir.
Yeah, hi.
हाय सर, ये गिटहब को आपने कैसे कनेक्ट किया है? मतलब
Sorry,
गिटहब को आपने कनेक्ट कैसे किया है उसको?
I told you that, right? In the config server, we have added my GitHub repository URL.
ओके,
This is my GitHub repository URL. I have given that step clearly in the notes.
So this is possible for a monolithic application.
Yes, you
Same
can do
thing.
that. Yeah, same thing you can do for monolith application also, but monolith application will be only one YML will be available. When it comes to microservices, for every microservice, one YML should be created.
Sir, how to configure multiple microservices with the single YML file? Because you are added only one name in application.puppet file, YML files.
Now I created one client application, sir. You need to create one more client application. This is one microservice. Similarly, you need to create one more microservice. Now that will become another client. Now I created Greet API. Similarly, you need to create Welcome API, Product API, Admin API. So I created one client to show you the demonstration how to connect to the config server. If you want one more microservice, same process you need to do. You just need to repeat this process. This process is there. The client config server application is there, and config client server client application development available. Here I have given the application name as Greet. If you want the Welcome API, same procedure you need to do. One more project you need to create. For that project, you need to give the name as Welcome. That will become another client for the config server. You got my point?
Yes, sir.
Hello.
Yes, sir.
You means for each client applications like Welcome API, Greet API, and Product API, Admin API, there are four client applications, and there will be 4 config server application required.
One config server will be available. All the 4 applications will connect with the same config server.
Only one.
Yes, one config server will be available. That is what you are seeing in the diagram, right?
Okay, don't know in config server applications. Okay, in application that properties. Okay, we are providing only Greet name. Okay, we are providing only Greet name. Okay, similarly, can we provide the prod admin Welcome API?
Man, we created one Greet API project. I configured the name as Greet. If you want, you can create one more project, and in that project, you will configure the name as product. You will create one more project. In that, you will configure name as admin. Like that, how many services you want, those many services you can create. I created one client application. You can create a second client, third client, fourth client also.
Yes, suppose I am creating four applications. Okay.
Then
And
you need to create 4 YMLs here. Every application should have its own YML.
Yes, in 4 YML file is required in GitHub. Okay, but in config server. Okay, in config server. Okay, we are at a time we are providing Greet. Currently, we are providing Greet. Can we provide in same properties files? Can we provide in same YML file? Can we provide Welcome Greet?
Kailas, you are totally confused. GitHub repository contains 4 YML files. Okay. Those 4 YML files will be loaded by one config server. That config server will load all the 4 YMLs. If you want to create 4 client applications, every application will have its own name, right? How can you configure multiple names for one application?
Yes, I got it. Yes.
One application will have only one name.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sir,
sir, could you please go once config server configuration?
Config server YML file will contain the location where that YML files are available.
This one, 7th line, sir. Clone on
start. That means whenever the config server application started, it will clone the GitHub repository for the YML files.
Okay. If not required, means we will put.
Right. By default, it is
what
false.
about Below one, sir, management.
Management security enabled false. That means so I don't want any secure connections for this for now. I want
Okay.
to directly check out the repository from the GitHub.
If we are using Spring Security means we need to do any changes.
We need to configure that in the Spring Security classes. You will understand that.
Okay, sure.
Hi, sir.
Another
In
one.
controller class, sir,
Ash,
there is a
one
one
second.
annotation are using.
URI, can we give the
We
local
use
path
the
also?
annotation at the rate of refresh scope annotation, correct?
One by one, guys, please.
Yes, yes, sir. Same question. What is the use of this annotation? Refresh.
Sir, refresh scope. So it is going to load the properties from the config server, right? What are the refresh scope annotation that I am configuring here? That is going to load the properties from the config server based on the fixed intervals. Refresh scope. Latest
Sir,
property should be
URI
loaded.
can local folder path also, sir.
You can give local folder path also here. I have given my GitHub central repository URL. You can give local file also here.
Okay.
But
Sir,
generally in
here-
real time, we will give the GitHub repository URLs.
The database details will be in cloud. We are communicating with the Git repository. How will it will communicate with cloud, sir, for database details?
What cloud database?
Yeah, actually, database details will be cloud, right?
Even if
AWS
you are, listen. Even if your database in the cloud, database URL, username, password, you need to configure in the YML file here. Database may be in the cloud, but the database URL will be available, username will be available, password will be available. Those things you need to configure in the YML file, which is available in the GitHub.
Okay, got it.
Yeah, from that YML, it will go to config server. From the config server, it will go to your project. Then your project will load that YML properties. It will connect to the database, which is in the cloud. Database can be available anywhere, but its properties should be available in the YML file here.
Okay, got it.
Sir, in
Hello,
Eureka
sir.
server, admin server, and this application, how to register with for the Eureka and admin server?
No need of registering this config server with the Eureka, right? This is the purpose of config server is different. It is just to load the properties from the YML. That's it. If you want, you can add Eureka client dependency and you can register with the Eureka. You can do that, but not required.
Okay.
Okay. So when I show you in the diagram also in the microservices, I did not register my config server with the Eureka server because it is not required. Generally, we don't do that. If you
Yes, sir.
see
Yes, sir.
here,
Understand.
not MVC architecture, microservices architecture. So now my welcome APIs, greet APIs, they will only connect with the config server. Okay. So now in the welcome API, greet API, you can add config server dependency and you can connect with the config server. That's it. Config server, no need to register with the Eureka. If you want, you can do that also. Fine. So guys, with this, you got the clarity. What is config server and how to access the config server from our properties?
Hello, sir.
What is the main purpose of config server?
Sorry.
Guys, what is the main purpose of config server?
Store
Decouple the properties
data inside distributed manner.
This is used to decouple our application from the properties. Our application properties will be in the GitHub repository and it will be loaded by config server. And from the config server, our application will load those properties. So tomorrow, if any changes that are required in the properties, we no need to repackage our application.
Sir, how to make sure that the config server started, because if it is having a DB properties and the other application will be depending on that one. So like
first we need to start the config server. There will be a checklist, sir. Whenever we are going for the deployment, there will be a checklist. First we need to start the config server, then only our remaining microservices will be started.
And it supports only GitHub repositories or any other repository? Only GitHub it supports?
Generally, people will use GitHub repositories. It will support your local file system also, sir.
Okay, sir.
Sir, at Oracle we use Aura Hub, sir. Even that would be supported, right? Aura Hub also.
Yes, you can, anything, any location you can give for that. I'm giving GitHub repository. Here I have given Git URL.
हेलो सर, वो गिटहब रिपोजिटरी का लाइसेंस भी लगता है ना? मतलब
It
हेलो,
is free only, open source. GitHub trial version is free.
okay.
In the company, they will purchase the license for the GitHub. Secured repositories will be available in the companies.
Yes, that's why I'm asking you because I already work on that. इसलिए मैंने पूछा कि इसका लाइसेंस लगता है ना?
कंपनी में लाइसेंस होता है, अभी इधर फ्री टायर यूज कर रहे हैं हम.
हाँ.
Okay, fine guys, good. Thank you. I want you people to practice this cloud config server. It is damn important concept because in the real time, every project will be using the config server because in the real time, we want to decouple our application from the properties. So please practice this. I will upload the class notes. Thank you guys. See you tomorrow.